Welcome to another episode of the Cartoon Curator. On this episode is going to be one for the ages as we delve into the origin of possibly the most prolific animation studio of all time in my book. The studio that I'm referring to is none other than Hanna Barbera. We will delve into the lives of the studio's founders, William Hanna and Joseph Barbera. Where and how did they get their start in the business? What led them to start their own studio? And what were the ideas behind a lot of their cartoon creations? We will also delve into the earlier years, their reign in Saturday morning TV animation, and also, when you speak of the studio, you can't ignore the one character that made them a bona fide household name, the one and only Scooby-Doo. Also, what is their relevancy today in the world of animation? All of these questions and more will be finally answered on this episode of the Cartoon Curator. It's 10 years after the turn of the century, the last century to be exact. So this would approximately make it the year 1910. This is the year that greatness would rear its presence, particularly in July of that year. For instance, Jack Johnson would go on to beat James Jeffries to become the first ever black world heavyweight boxing champion. And also, Cy Young would go on to win his 500th game as well. But in between these two momentous events, in the quaint town of Melrose, New Mexico, a boy would be conceived by John and Avise Joyce Hanna. They would go on to name him William, after his father, of course. He was the third out of 7 children. He was also born into an Irish-American family who valued hard work. In fact, William Sr. worked as a construction superintendent for railroads and water sewer systems. And Avise was a stay-at-home mom, which is definitely a hard job itself. Unfortunately, William Sr.'s job would cause them to migrate around the country, so William never had a chance to make any real friends, but what he gained instead was a sense of exploration and adventure. His father's work would lead them to places like Oregon, where he developed his love for the outdoors. But once again, William and the rest of the family had to move along. This would lead them to Utah and ultimately California. They would settle in Watts, California and stay throughout his teenage years from 1925 to 1928. There, he would learn how to play music such as the sax at Compton High School. Yes, the same Compton the rap supergroup NWA would emerge from 60 plus years later. William would eventually attend college to study journalism and structural engineering. It seemed that William had his future set out for him until the Great Depression rocked America. During that time, many had suffered from mass unemployment, and companies had also suffered from the effects of it due to the stock crash of 1929. This also affected William as his collegiate dreams had to be put aside. In other words, he had to drop out of college. William didn't let this deter him though, because he took a page from his father's playbook and worked as a construction engineer. But instead of working on railroads, he decided to work at Pantages Theater in Hollywood. Fortunately for William, this gig would be brief. It seemed that this was it for William. But one day, upon talking with his sister's boyfriend, he had learned about a job at Pacific Title and Art. Being the eager man that he was, William would take a shot and had gotten a job. Pacific Title and Art was a place that had produced movie title cards and was ran by one man by the name of Leon Schlesinger. The name sounds familiar. Oh well, we'll get to that shortly. Anyway, William would soon discover that he actually had a talent for drawing, so by 1930, William seized an opportunity that was too good for him to refuse. See, he joined an animation studio called Harman-Ising Studios, which was ran by two emerging animators at the time by the name of Hugh Harman and Rudy Ising. These two were quite talented in their field. In fact, they would go on to create the Looney Tunes and Merry Melodies series. Now, speaking of Leon Schlesinger, remember when I said that his name sounded familiar? Well, no wonder it did. See, on top of him running Pacific Title and Art, he would go on to form Leon Schlesinger Productions and produce those early Warner Brothers cartoons. So this means that William wasn't too far from his reach, for Harman-Ising Studios had a partnership with Leon. Also, being related to the Warner Brothers themselves also helped as well, right? And yes, the company was really named after two brothers named Warner. Who would have known? Anyway, Harmon and Ising would go on to work on the Bosco cartoons. Upon them working on their projects, William would gain more opportunity by doing odd jobs there. Their hard work wouldn't go unnoticed because MGM had seen what they were doing with Warner Brothers and wanted a piece of the action. What had awaited young William was an opportunity that would not only change his life, but also cross paths with someone who would cement him to his destiny. With the success of the partnership between Leon Schlesinger and Harman-Ising Studios, the Looney Tunes Merry Melodies cartoons had flourished, but with success came others knocking on the door. William was along for the ride, considering he was working in the art and paint department at the time. Those who came knocking were Metro Goldwyn Mayer Studios, but they would be better known as MGM. So, Harman and Ising packed their bags and left for greener pastures. And guess who came with them? William, of course. This was definitely a fruitful partnership to say the least. They would introduce the Happy Harmony series of cartoons at MGM, starting with 1934's The Discontented Canary, which was shot entirely in Technicolor. This initial cartoon was very successful, and it was followed up by Bosco's first outing on MGM, Bosco's Parlor Pranks. But it would be in 1935 when they finally caught the eye of the Academy of Television Arts and Sciences Committee with nomination for Best Animated Short for the entry The Calico Dragon. Harman and Ising were doing great things at their new home, and they knew the prowess that their talent had, but they both seen something special in William in particular. In the following year, they gave him a shot at directing his very first cartoon. He would make his debut with the 14th installment of the Happy Harmony series with 1936's To Spring. To say the least, his debut was very successful. William had finally found his true calling. Apparently, MGM had seen it as well, considering they would break away from Harman and Ising and bring the production solely to their neck of the woods. And guess who came with them? William, of course. Yes, in 1938, they formed MGM Cartoons, and William was given a bigger shot at the then newly formed animation studio, as he got the job to direct their Captain and the Kid series. Long story short, the series was a failure for them, so unfortunately, William would get demoted. Most would say this was a bad thing, but in William's case, this would actually lead to something better. We will get to why he did in due time. Anyway, William was a guy who made friends in the company, and this proved to be a great thing because across from his desk sat a fellow employee by the name of Joseph Barbera. Now with Joe, you had a man who had a different path to get to that desk he sat in. See, whereas William grew up in the western region and lived nomadically throughout his whole childhood, Joseph grew up in the East Coast in the Little Italy section of Manhattan. Joseph was conceived on March 24, 1911 to Italian immigrating parents Vincent Barbera and Francesca Calvaca Barbera. He was the first of three brothers. Joseph didn't have the same pleasant upbringing that William had, unfortunately. See, Vincent wasn't the best of fathers, despite him owning 3 barbershops to provide for his family. He couldn't provide mostly due to his excessive gambling, and this, among other things, would ultimately drive him to abandon his family when Joe was only 15 years old. Like all kids his age, Joe needed an avenue to escape the street life. He would take up boxing and actually won a few titles while he was in high school. He would eventually lose interest in it, but he would find a new one when he seen a screening of Disney's The Skeleton Dance. He knew right then that he wanted to do something involving animation. It was his destiny, considering at the age of 3, he already had a talent for drawing and nurtured it up to this point. Joe was trying to make moves at this time as he got his drawings in the New York Hits magazine, but they proved to be unsuccessful. Fortunately, in due time, he would eventually gain a foothold drawing for other publications. Mind you, this was all while he was working part-time at a bank. Joe knew that he had to make it legit, so he enrolled in the Art Students of New York. Yes, the same school our previous 2 subjects, Max Fleischer and Walter Lantz, would get their schooling at. So to say the school was prestigious would be an understatement at this point. Speaking of Max, he would actually get a job at Fleischer Studios in the art and paint department. Yes, this means that a lot of the great cartoons from the Fleischer Studios era had Joe's involvement in it. This gig would lead him to another one at Van Buren Studios and eventually to Terry Toon Studios in 1936. But another opportunity would come knocking for him. That was a spot at MGM. There he would stumble upon, well, you know the rest at this point. These 2 men of 2 different backgrounds who shared the same passion for animation would become friends and partners almost overnight. But little did they know, destiny was about to take them to greater heights. MGM Cartoon Studios were in full gear by 1939. They were producing cartoons such as Count Screwloose, Barney Bear, and Good Monkeys. But these weren't enough to make a dent on what Fleischer Studios and Disney were doing at the time. But MGM didn't become the studio they became by backing down. They would bring on a man by the name of Fred Quimby. He was a very sought-after independent producer who had previously worked for Fox Film, and they hired him to head up their short features department 12 years prior. By 1937, he had been moved to MGM's animation department to be its executive producer. Meanwhile, William Hanna and Joseph Barbera's partnership was well underway, and they cooked up an idea that they believed in heavily. They decided that it was now or never to make their mark at MGM. They both presented Fred with a proposal for a series of cartoons. Initially, he didn't believe in the idea, but on a slight whim, he decided to greenlight it. And then we got this. Yes, here they are. Hanna and Barbera's first creation as a duo, Jasper and Jinx. They would make their debut with 1940's Puss Gets the Boot. In the cartoon, it establishes the whole dynamic between Jasper and Jinx from the onset. A cat chasing a mouse around the house while being threatened to be thrown out. The cartoon became a huge hit with audiences, and their names were changed to Tom and Jerry upon critical praise of the cartoon. Fred finally seen the potential in Hanna and Barbera. This meant more Tom and Jerry cartoons for MGM and Hanna Barbera's future success. They achieved it again by getting their second Academy Award nomination the following year with the short The Night Before. But their true success would finally come in 1943 with the short Yankee Doodle Mouse. To say they were a success was an understatement. Tom and Jerry had become the talk of the industry. The shorts had become so popular that MGM would pump out 4 to 5 shorts a year from that time into the 1950s. This was definitely unprecedented considering how much labor it had taken just to make one cartoon. So it's easy to say that Tom and Jerry were the face of MGM Cartoon Studios at this point. This also had afforded Hanna Barbera to work with the creme de la creme of the animation industry as well. William Hanna and Joseph Barbera continued to make Tom and Jerry cartoons, but they would soon find out that they would have to attain new heights to keep the ball rolling. A new frontier would come knocking on the door.
Our bravest knight sets out to slay the dragon, but
if I can't, find a dragon, I won't have to slay it. Get it?
William and Joe had achieved the success that they had wanted, but unfortunately, as I mentioned before in the previous episodes, television had started becoming more accessible to households by the late 50s. The studios started to feel that way and had loosened their loyalty to theatrical releases. In other words, releasing shorts weren't marketable anymore. So instead, most studios opted to sell their cartoons to the television networks. By 1957, MGM had seen what was happening. They had stopped producing cartoons for a while and sold their cartoons to the networks. In turn, they got rid of most of their staff, including William and Joe. As they realized that it was more profitable to continually re-release older cartoons than to release new ones. William and Joe also knew that the days of theatrical shorts were being phased out slowly, so they decided to branch into television on their own. They would team up with Jay Ward, who would go on to create The Rocky and Bullwinkle Show. All three of them would collaborate and form Shield Productions. Unfortunately, the partnership wasn't as fruitful for William and Joe as they had imagined it would be, so they cut their ties with Jay and made a better decision. They decided to embark on their own and create HB Enterprises, which would be later known as Hanna Barbera Productions, with the partnership of Screen Gems that same year. With that partnership cemented, they would go on to create their first cartoon series.
Get set, get ready, here comes Rough and Ready. They're tough but steady, always rough and ready. They sometimes have their little spats, even fight like dogs and cats, but when they need each other, that's when they're rough and ready.
Yes, this would be their first outing, the Rough and Ready Show. It would make its debut on December 14th, 1957 on NBC and in full color. In this cartoon, Hanna-Barbera utilized the same dynamic and formula that they had used for their Tom and Jerry cartoons. But instead of being a cat and mouse and then being adversaries, Rough and Ready were a cat and dog respectively, and they were roommates and buddies. Also, the show would employ a technique that would be common practice by the 1960s, limited animation. This was due to the budget that Screen Gems had given them. This was television. It wasn't a medium that made money through ticket sales. Instead, it was a medium that relied on ad revenue, so the less money they could spend, the better. And just in case that their investment wasn't as fruitful as they imagined it would be. Fortunately for them, it was. NBC had a hit on their hands. It was such a hit, NBC would sign them to a 5-year contract to produce and develop additional cartoons for them. This series would also bring about the infancy of Saturday morning cartoon programming. Despite that though, Hanna and Barbera wanted to mark new territory and bring something special to television. Something they could never do when they were at MGM. They would deliver on that promise in 1958.
And a hound dog, howdy to you. This is Detective Huckleberry Hound tracking down.
Yes, Hanna and Barbera would present American audiences with their second creation, The Huckleberry Hound Show, in first-run syndication. Hanna and Barbera had set out to make something that was unlike anything seen in animation at the time. See, this show was a hybrid of live action segments and animation. Despite the show being named after the titular character, the show also comprised of 2 other segments. One starring Yogi Bear, a picnic basket stealing bear who resided in Jellystone Park alongside his buddy Boo Boo. They both constantly outsmarted Ranger Smith with their antics. The other segment was Pixie and Dixie and Mr. Jinx, which also once again employed the Tom and Jerry formula. Even the dynamic was the same, except for 2 things. The cat actually talked, and it was 2 mice instead of 1. The Huckleberry Hound Show was a big hit, and it is actually credited by most as being the cartoon that popularized television animation. The show would go on to win an Emmy in 1960, a first for an animated program, and on top of that, it wasn't on any of the major networks. Hanna and Barbera finally established themselves as major players in the world of television animation, but they were soon on the steps of creating something that would change cartoons as we knew it. With the success of the Rough and Ready show and the Huckleberry Hound show, they would be allowed to bring more animation to TV. In 1959, Hanna-Barbera would release their 3rd outing, The Quick Draw McGraw Show. It was about an anamorphic horse who was a deputy alongside his sidekick, Baba Louie. Just like the show that preceded it, this also had 3 segments that involved a father and son duo called Augie Doggie and Doggie Daddy, and a cat and mouse detective duo by the name of Snoop and Blabber. This show would also air in first-run syndication, and it was actually a companion piece to the Huckleberry Hound Show. The Quick Draw McGraw Show was their spoof on westerns, the sitcom My 3 Sons, and detective shows, respectively. With the success of these 3 animated shows, Screen Gems wanted to make the duo tackle a spot that was ready to be conquered: network primetime. But they didn't have any kind of idea on what they had wanted to do. Then they thought about what a primetime cartoon would look like, and they both instantly thought of one format that dominated airways at the time: the sitcom. What would they conjure up? Well, in 1960, they would give us that answer. Here it is, the first ever primetime sitcom, The Flintstones. And it would make its debut on December 30th, 1960 on ABC. For this outing, they would look for inspiration from a sitcom at the time, The Honeymooners. But instead of being set in modern times and in Brooklyn, William Hanna had a different idea entirely. See, he set the animated sitcom in the prehistoric era and in a town known as Bedrock. The show starred Fred Flintstone, who was obviously a take on Ralph Cramden, who worked at a stone quarry and was married to Wilma Flintstone, who was a take on Alice Cramden. These two characters were voiced by Alan Reed and Gene Vanderpill, respectively. Accompanying him was his best buddy and next-door neighbor, Barney Rubble, who was a take on Ed Norton, of course, and his wife, Betty Rubble, who was a take on Trixie Norton. They were voiced by the legendary Mel Blanc, who by this point was known as the man of 1,000 voices. And Betty Rubble was voiced by Bea Bendeneret, respectively. According to William Hanna, he told the author Ted Sennett that he would watch The Honeymooners and laugh until tears ran down his cheeks. So it's easy to say that Hanna and Barbera decided that this was what they wanted to present the audience. That same feeling that William had when he was watching The Honeymooners. And that it did, because the audience took an instant liking to it, and it became a hit at ABC. Despite the critics lambasting it, it became such a hit that the executives at ABC wanted more shows like it on its network. Hanna and Barbera would deliver on that request. The show became a success, but the networks knew that kids were also tuning in to watch more, so they had to cut ties with their old sponsors, which was none other than Winston Cigarettes. Yes, cigarettes, something you could never see on television today. In its place, Welch's Grape Juice and Skippy Peanut Butter became the new sponsors. This was also for another reason. See, in the episode Dress Rehearsal that aired on February 22nd, 1963, Wilma made television history as the first female, anime no less, to give birth to a baby on TV, even though it was off screen. Here, we are introduced to the new member of the Flintstones family, Pebbles Flintstone. The Rebels wouldn't go without one for long, because in the October 3rd, 1963 episode titled Little Bam Bam, Bam Bam would make his first appearance. Whereas Pebbles was birthed by Wilma, Bam Bam was a baby that was left on the Rebels' doorstep. The audience liked this change because the Flintstones continued to languish in a TV landscape. That's until trouble came brewing for the show during the 1963-64 season, where unfortunately Bea Bendeneret would be replaced by Jerry Johnson. Supposedly, she was Joe Barbera's main squeeze, and she was replaced due to favoritism, but it was also known that Bea was a regular on another sitcom at the time, Petticoat Junction, and couldn't commit to the Flintstones full-time. No matter the case, that wasn't even the problem that the show had faced. The real problem was the arrival of another soon-to-be classic sitcom that would take TV by storm, The Munsters. The Munsters became such a hit for CBS, it actually made ABC switch the Flintstones time slot on December 1964. Fortunately, this ended up being a great move because they recovered enough to get another season. During its run, Hanna-Barbera would debut another cartoon in 1961 called Top Cat. This time, its inspiration would come from the Phil Silver Show. This one went back to an older style of character representation. In other words, anamorphic animals. The main character was a charismatic, quick-witted street cat who tried to get over on Officer Dibble any way that he could. Just like how Silver's Sergeant Bilko tried to get over on his superiors. The cartoon would also be inspired by the Bowery Boys series, which focused on a group of hooligans that had a rough side but also had hearts of gold. Top Cat would be billed as an adult cartoon. Top Cat was definitely different from the Flintstones though. Whereas the Flintstones was built from the mind of William Hanna, Top Cat was made from the ideas of Joe Barbera. He could relate to the whole concept in a way that nobody around him could. As I mentioned before, Joe grew up rough in the streets of Little Italy, New York. And Top Cat was the same. He was a street cat, and he grew up in a place where you had to use your wit to survive and get over. Just like Joe had to. Also, Hanna-Barbera wanted to make a cartoon that kids and adults could relate to in a personal way. being carefree and having freedom. But, like the Flintstones, Top Cat was not well received by critics and by viewers as well. See, Top Cat wouldn't translate to success as by April of 1962, it had gotten to a point that during the show's run, sponsors had dropped out rapidly. Top Cat would be canceled on the network by 1962, and the reruns were thrown into Saturday morning programming. Prior to Top Cat, they at least had another cartoon that had became a marginal hit in syndication. See, even though they were making primetime cartoons for ABC, they had still managed to pump out cartoons for the syndicate market. This cartoon would be the Yogi Bear Show. Yes, the cartoon bear from the segments on the Huckleberry Hound show spearheaded his own show. Despite Top Cat not being the success that they had hoped it would be, this didn't deter Hanna Barbera from making more animated shows for primetime. On September 23, 1962, a new animated series would make its way to airwaves. Lo and behold, Hanna Barbera would present American audiences with the Jetsons. For this cartoon, they definitely went a different route. Remember, this was the 60s, and it was a time where the space race was fully underway. In fact, during that year, the Jetsons premiered, an astronaut by the name of John Glenn would become the first man to ever orbit the Earth. So, the promise of the future had captivated Americans at this point, and Hanna-Barbera wanted to reflect upon that in the Jetsons. The show would be centered around George Jetson, who was actually a middle-class worker living in a future that was very idealistic. This was a future where cars actually flew, houses were all high-rise to where they were almost above the clouds, walkways that carted citizens into their homes, food machines that instantly made meals, and closets that clothed you instantly. Basically, this was a future where people barely did nothing because everything was basically done for them. Heck, even though George worked for a living, he only worked for a whopping 3 hours a day, pushing buttons for an overbearing boss by the name of Mr. Spacely, which was voiced by Mel Blanc, of course. The show was drastically different from the Flintstones, aside from the futuristic setting. Unlike Fred Flintstone, George was already a family man from the beginning. He had a wife, Jane Jetson, a daughter named Judy, and a son named Elroy. They even had a dog by the name of Astro. Astro was quite the dog. You see, whereas Dino just barked loud, Astro was actually vocal and spoke with a speech impediment. Also, they had a robot maid, Rosie, who was voiced by Jean Vanderpil, who was pulling double duty for Hanna-Barbera. Speaking of Jean, the Jetsons was designed to be somewhat of a companion piece to the Flintstones. In fact, one critic would say that the Jetsons was one of the rarities in television that a producing studio using the same formula could follow one hit after the other. The Jetsons was marketed as a show about a family that had the same problems that the audience had, despite them living in the future. Hanna and Barbera wanted the viewer to envision what the American family would be like 100 years into the future. Heck, the show even took place in 2062. The audience had taken a good response to the show, but unfortunately, competition from Walt Disney's Wonderful World of Color would put them in a very tight spot. This was Walt Disney. By this time, he was cementing himself as the leader of family entertainment and would bring that audience to NBC in droves. This alone ruined any chance of the Jetsons gaining a foothold. Unfortunately, it would never gain that because by the end of the 1962-63 season, it would be canceled by ABC. But ABC still had the Flintstones, so It wasn't too much of a loss, right? Well, it seemed that way at first. The show had started to grow stale by the 1964-65 season as it delved more into the fantastical territory and started to lose sight on what made the show initially great in the first place. Nevertheless, its continued success had warranted them to create another primetime cartoon, which would actually be placed in the time slot that the Flintstones was previously on. This one would take animation in a bold direction. Here it is, Johnny Quest. It would make its debut on September 18, 1964. Johnny Quest was quite different from anything they had done up to this point. Hanna and Barbera decided that they wanted to create a cartoon based on the pulp graphic novels of the 1930s and 40s that they used to read as kids, particularly Terry and the Pirates, which was adored by Joe. So, for this animated series, they had employed a different kind of art style. They recruited Doug Wilday for the project. This was a man who had experience in that graphic style. He gained critical acclaim with his graphic novel Rio, and also did work for DC and Marvel at the time. So it's easy to say that Hanna and Barbera had picked the right man for the job. And they sure did, because the show instantly gave the viewer a sense of adventure upon seeing the intro as well in the episodes. In fact, the show employed a spy element, even down to the villain who was patterned after James Bond's Dr. No. Also, Hanna and Barbera decided that a kid should be the main character of the show, hence the title of the show. 11-year-old Johnny Quest was like every young boy, except he wanted to go on dangerous adventures around the world. He accompanied his father, Dr. Benton Quest, a scientist and investigator for the U.S. government, alongside Haji, an East Asian orphan who was the same age as Johnny, but he was definitely a great asset to the cast. This kid had mystical powers. He would become Johnny's adoptive brother. And then you had Race Bannon, who resembled Doc Savage, was the real action hero of the show. Race did it all. He was a secret agent, a bodyguard skilled in hand-to-hand combat and firearms, and a pilot. Quite the resume. On top of that, he served as a mentor teacher to Johnny and Haji. Rounding out the cast was Bandit, pet dog. Initially, Doug Wilday hated the character and wanted it to be a pet monkey instead. But Hanna-Barbera felt that making a dog the mascot of the show would provide them merchandising opportunities and comic relief. Bandit delivered on both of these fronts. But what Doug did have was creative control on the look of the show. Gone were the simplistic hand-drawn backgrounds and limited animation of the previous Hanna-Barbera productions. In its place were scenery that leaned heavy on shadows to create a mature vibe. Also, the characters employed the same graphic style that Doug used in his comics. To achieve this look, Doug had to bring in his own team of animators and cartoonists. He felt that those who did the previous Hanna-Barbera productions were inadequate for the job. This also made the cartoon expensive to produce at the time as well. Nevertheless, Hanna and Barbera were adamant on making the show a success. They wanted to do what Max Fleischer had done with Superman years prior. Make a cartoon that was never seen before on television. The audience had seen his vision as well because Johnny Quest was a hit for them, but not without controversy. See, Johnny Quest was definitely different, as it had a decent amount of violence and action, with villains often dying off screen. This wouldn't bode too well with parents, considering that the main character was a young boy to begin with. Despite that, it was a hit for them, until later in 1964 when Hanna-Barbera in their efforts to save the Flintstones from its sagging ratings, moved Johnny Quest out of its time slot that it was gaining traction in and swapped it out. This would be a disastrous move on Johnny Quest's part. See, the Munsters was still a hit on CBS, and as I mentioned before, sitcoms were a huge commodity on network television. To expect Johnny Quest, which was already the proverbial odd man out, to dethrone a sitcom was quite a tall order. Not surprisingly, it wasn't meant to be. Its last episode would be aired on March 11, 1965. But the cancellation of Johnny Quest was the least of their worries. The Flintstones had continued to fall in the ratings. As I mentioned before, they had brought in Kazoo and started to deviate away from what made the earlier seasons successful, in an attempt to save the show. But this time, the show couldn't escape its demise, because at the end of the 1964-65 season, the Flintstones would be canceled at ABC. This was a huge blow to Hanna Barbera at the time, and they decided that they wanted to stay away from primetime television. They had managed to keep that promise for a while, until 1967 came around. Hanna Barbera would cut ties with ABC as they fulfilled their promise to the network, and it was time to fulfill their promise they had made to NBC 10 years prior. They did it with Jack and the Beanstalk. This TV special was their take on the classic tale, starring Gene Kelly no less. This would mark another revolution for them on television, the combination of live action and animation. Something that was particularly and fully touched upon with Max Fleischer's Gulliver Travels and the 1941 Merry Melody short You Ought to Be in the Pictures, respectively. Jack and the Beanstalk was a huge hit for NBC and actually garnered an Emmy for Hanna-Barbera for Outstanding Children's Program. With the success of Jack and the Beanstalk, it was fitting that NBC went to strike gold twice. They wanted a full series that employed that same concept. Hanna-Barbera decided that instead of a fairy tale to recreate, they would recreate a work from a classic literary author instead, Mark Twain. On December 15, 1968, the New Adventures of Huckleberry Finn would make its debut on NBC primetime television. With this one, Hanna and Barbera decided to change things up a bit. First off, the production cost of the show was brought up higher. In fact, at the time, it was widely regarded as the most expensive show on television. Just like Jack and the Beanstalk, it employed live actors and the use of blue screen for the animation as the actors interacted with characters that were animated. To pull this off, the cast had to be talented. They managed to round up a good cast for this one. The role of Huck Finn went to Michael Shea, who played bit roles on Bewitched and Mission Impossible. The role of Tom Sawyer went to Henry Schultz, who was already familiar to television as he played on another show called The Monroes, a TV Western. Luann Haslam was cast as Becky Thatcher. She only had commercial experience at the time, so this role was one of her first. But the big star of the show had to be Ted Cassidy, who actually played the role of Lurch on The Addams Family 4 years prior. In fact, this was a good opportunity for him as an actor. He definitely felt that this would be a breakout role for him. Second, it didn't use stories from the book at all, but it did use the characters from Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer. The show was very loosely based on the books. When I mean loosely, I mean to a point where they injected other stories that were unrelated to the books. See, Hanna-Barbera had this idea that they should make the show a fantasy tale, as the premise of the show was that the villain from The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Injun Joe, had escaped from prison and wanted revenge against Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer, and when he pursues them, Huck, Tom, along with Becky, get caught up in a time warp and sent off to a fantastical animated landscape. The idea was definitely outlandish to say the least. This definitely didn't bode well with TV critics and avid fans of the books. I guess ignoring the fact that Injun Joe actually dies in the books and instead turned into a cartoon character that donned disguises, and the trio being in stories that were unrelated to them might have did the trick. They even used Don Quixote as a basis for one episode called The Huck of La Mancha. To make a long story short, this show wasn't well received at all. The critics hated it, the audiences didn't like it. In fact, it would rank at number 86 in the Nielsen ratings. Now, to understand how bad it was, that week Nielsen tracked 86 programs. Ouch. To say that this show was a stinker is an understatement. It would never crack into the top 10 during its run. It was even used as filler for any program that was preempted. It's safe to say that this show didn't get another season. And that it did, because it ended on September 7th, 1969. It seemed that Hanna and Barbera's candle had flickered out, but this would only be for a short time, because soon they would usher in a new era that would change the face of Saturday mornings entirely. This here marks the end of the history of Hanna-Barbera Part 1. I would love to thank you all for watching. In Part 2, we will continue on the second half of the studio's work, including their tremendous Saturday morning cartoon output and beyond. So please be on the lookout for that. And I would like to give a special thanks to these people here. Till then, Godspeed.